Man laughs at poor family. 10 seconds later, Steve Harvey shuts him down. There was a time when people understood that a person's worth had nothing to do with what they wore or how much money they had in the bank. A time when character mattered more than clothes and dignity was given to every human being regardless of their circumstances. But on a Wednesday afternoon in July 2024, a man in the Family Feud studio audience forgot that lesson. When a family walked onto the stage in clothes that had clearly seen better days, this man laughed. He laughed loud enough for the microphones to pick it up, loud enough for the family to hear it, and loud enough for Steve Harvey to hear it. What happened next took exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds for Steve Harvey to turn around, locate the source of that laughter, and deliver a response so powerful, so precise, and so devastatingly righteous that the man who laughed wished he could disappear into his seat. The audience erupted. The family stood tall. And by the time Steve Harvey was finished, every person in that building understood exactly what happens when you disrespect someone on his stage. Before we dive into this story, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. What Steve Harvey said to that man is something every single person on this planet needs to hear. The Ackhafer family from Cleveland, Ohio, walked onto the Family Feud stage, and from the very first moment they looked different from every other family that had appeared on the show that week. They were not wearing matching custom shirts with a clever family name printed on the front. They were not dressed in coordinated outfits that had been planned weeks in advance. They were wearing the best clothes they had, and the best clothes they had were not much. The family captain was a woman named Grace Ackhafer. She was 47 years old, and she was wearing a simple dark blouse that had been ironed so carefully you could see the creases from where the iron had been pressed hard enough to make the worn fabric look presentable. Her shoes were clean but visibly old, the leather cracking slightly at the toe. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she wore no jewelry except a thin gold band on her left hand that she twisted when she was nervous, which was often. Grace was a certified nursing assistant who worked the overnight shift at a rehabilitation facility in East Cleveland, earning $16 an hour for 12-hour shifts that left her body aching and her sleep schedule permanently disrupted. She had been doing this work for 11 years, ever since she and her husband Emmanuel had arrived in the United States from Lagos, Nigeria, with their 2 young children and a suitcase each. Emmanuel Ackhafer stood next to his wife. He was 51 years old, a tall, dignified man with a quiet bearing that suggested depth rather than absence. Emmanuel wore a button-down shirt that was slightly too large for him, tucked into pants that had been hemmed by hand. His shoes were polished to a shine so intense that they caught the studio lights, a detail that would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the entire episode. Emmanuel was an accountant, not in America. In Nigeria, he had been a senior accountant at one of the largest banks in Lagos, a man who wore tailored suits and drove a company car and provided his family with a comfortable upper-middle-class life. When the family immigrated, his credentials were not recognized. His degrees were not transferable. The career he had spent 20 years building evaporated the moment he stepped off the plane. For the past 11 years, Emmanuel had worked as a janitor at a middle school in Cleveland. He cleaned classrooms and mopped hallways and emptied trash cans, and he did it with the same meticulous attention to detail that he had once applied to corporate balance sheets. He never complained, not once, not to Grace, not to his children, not to anyone. The third member of the team was the Ackhafer's oldest child, their daughter Adiz, who was 22. Adiz was wearing a blouse borrowed from her college roommate and pants she had bought at a second-hand store the week before the taping. She was a senior at Cleveland State University, studying accounting, because she was going to finish what her father had started. She was going to earn the American credentials that would restore the career he had been forced to leave behind. That was her private mission, the thing she thought about every time she sat in a lecture hall and listened to professors teach concepts her father had mastered decades ago in another language on another continent. Adiz worked 2 part-time jobs while maintaining a 3.8 GPA, and she slept an average of 5 hours a night, a number she never mentioned to her parents because she did not want them to worry. The fourth member was the Ackhafer's son, Chidi, who was 19 and in his first year at Cuyahoga Community College. Chidi was wearing his only dress shirt, a white button-down that Grace had washed and pressed the night before the taping. Chidi wanted to be an engineer. He was brilliant with numbers and spatial reasoning, the kind of student who could solve problems in his head that other students needed calculators for. But community college was what the family could afford, so community college was where Chidi went, without complaint, without bitterness, with the same acceptance of circumstance that his parents had modeled for him his entire life. The fifth member was Emmanuel's younger brother, Obira, who was 44 and worked as a security guard at a warehouse in Akron. Obira had arrived in the United States 3 years after Emmanuel and Grace, following the same path his brother had blazed and landing in the same reality. A man with a master's degree in economics working a job that required no degree at all. Obira had a deep laugh and an easy warmth that put people at ease, and he was the one who had convinced the family to apply for Family Feud. "We need something joyful," Obira had told Emmanuel. "We work all the time, we save all the time, we sacrifice all the time. Let us go have one day of joy." Emmanuel had resisted, the way Emmanuel resisted anything that felt like putting himself forward. But Grace had sided with Obira, and when Grace made a decision, Emmanuel respected it. The Acaffer family was facing off against the Patterson family from Columbus, Ohio. The Pattersons were a polished, well-dressed family who arrived in matching emerald green shirts with Patterson Power emblazoned on the front. They had professional-looking name tags, coordinated accessories, and the confident energy of a family that had been looking forward to their television appearance for months. The contrast between the two families was stark, and it was visible to everyone in the studio from the moment both teams took their places behind their podiums. Steve Harvey came out and greeted both families. When he reached the Acafors, he shook Emmanuel's hand and noted the shine on his shoes. "My man, those shoes are cleaner than mine," Steve said, looking down at Emmanuel's feet with genuine appreciation. Emmanuel smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his usually serious face. "In my country, Mr. Harvey, a man is judged by the condition of his shoes. My father taught me that a polished shoe says to the world, I may not have much, but I respect myself." Steve nodded slowly, the kind of nod that said he had just heard something worth remembering. "I like that," Steve said. "I like that a lot." He moved on to greet the rest of the family, not knowing that Emmanuel's polished shoes and the family's well-worn clothes were about to become the center of a moment that would shake his studio to its foundation. The game began, and from the very first question, it was clear that the Acaffer family was not there to make up the numbers. They were there to win. Grace gave a number 1 answer in the first round, delivered in her precise, accented English with a confidence that surprised everyone, including herself. The audience applauded warmly. Emmanuel followed with a strong answer of his own, stepping up to the podium with the careful, measured movements of a man who treated every moment with intention. Adiz contributed a clever answer in the second round that made Steve shake his head in admiration. Chitty matched her with a response that demonstrated the sharp, analytical mind his teachers always praised. Obira got the audience laughing with a bold answer that Steve called dangerously honest. By the third round, the Acaffer family was leading the Pattersons by a comfortable margin. They were playing beautifully, supporting each other after every answer, celebrating quietly but genuinely, and conducting themselves with a grace that made the audience root for them instinctively. People in the studio were leaning forward in their seats, drawn in by this family's energy, by the way they carried themselves, by the obvious love and respect that flowed between them. Then the incident happened. It was between rounds, during a brief pause while the production team set up the next question. The studio was not silent during these pauses. There was the usual murmur of conversation, the shuffle of the audience adjusting in their seats, the low hum of the equipment. And then, cutting through all of it, came a laugh. Not a chuckle, not a quiet snicker. A loud, deliberate, mocking laugh that originated from the left side of the audience, about 6 rows back. A man in a gray sport coat, later identified only by his first name, Craig, had leaned over to the woman sitting next to him and said something while looking directly at the Acaffer family. Several audience members in the surrounding seats later confirmed what he said. He had looked at the Acaffor's clothes, at Grace's worn shoes and Emmanuel's oversized shirt, and he had said, "Look at what they are wearing. They look like they came straight from the Goodwill. How did they even get on the show?" Then he laughed, loudly, openly, without any attempt to disguise his contempt. The microphones picked up the laugh. The people in the front rows heard it clearly, and the Acaffer family heard it. Grace's hand went to her blouse, a self-conscious gesture that she caught and stopped, but not before the cameras captured it. Emmanuel's jaw tightened, and he looked down at his polished shoes, the same shoes Steve Harvey had admired minutes earlier, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, something worse. Shame, the look of a man who had been working his entire life to hold his dignity intact and who had just been told, publicly, that it was not enough. Adiz stepped closer to her father. Chitty's face went hard, the way a young man's face goes hard when he wants to say something but has been raised to control himself. Obira looked toward the source of the laugh with an expression that carried the quiet fury of a man who had spent his entire adult life being underestimated because of where he came from and what he wore. Steve Harvey heard the laugh. He had been looking at his card, preparing for the next round, but his head snapped up at the sound. Steve had been doing live television long enough to know the difference between the laughter of joy and the laughter of cruelty. He knew what mockery sounded like, and in that instant, his entire demeanor changed. Steve did not address the audience immediately. He looked at the Acaffer family first. He saw Grace's hand on her blouse. He saw Emmanuel staring at his shoes. He saw the children circling their parents like a protective formation. And he saw, in the space of a few seconds, a family that had traveled from Nigeria to Cleveland to this stage, carrying everything they owned and everything they were, being made to feel small by a man who had never carried anything heavier than his own sense of superiority. Steve Harvey set his card down on the podium. He turned his entire body toward the audience. And what happened next took exactly 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds would be replayed millions of times around the world. Steve Harvey looked into the audience, and his eyes found Craig in the gray sport coat with the precision of a man who had been locating hecklers in comedy clubs since before most of the audience was born. Steve did not point. He did not shout. He simply locked eyes with the man and began to speak. "Sir, I heard you." Steve's voice was calm, controlled, the kind of calm that comes right before thunder. "I heard what you said about this family. And I want to make sure you hear what I am about to say to you because I am only going to say it once." The studio went dead silent. Craig shifted in his seat, the smirk on his face dissolving as he realized that every camera in the building had just found him. "You looked at this family and you laughed at what they are wearing," Steve said. "You looked at their clothes and you decided that you knew who they were. You decided that because their shoes are not new and their shirts are not designer, they do not belong here. On my stage, on my show." Steve paused. The pause was surgical, time to let the weight of his words settle over the room like a verdict. "Let me tell you who is standing on this stage right now." Steve turned and gestured toward Emmanuel. "This man is a senior accountant. He managed corporate finances at one of the largest banks in Nigeria. He has more education and more professional experience in his left hand than most people accumulate in a lifetime. When he came to this country, his degrees were not recognized. His career was erased overnight. So you know what he did? He became a janitor, not because he could not do anything else, but because his family needed to eat and he was willing to do whatever it took to feed them. And he gets up every single morning, puts on those shoes, polishes them until they shine, and goes to work. Every single day, without complaining, without making excuses, without asking anybody for pity." Steve's voice was rising, not in volume but in intensity, each word landing harder than the last. "His wife works the overnight shift at a nursing home, 12 hours on her feet, taking care of people who cannot take care of themselves. Their daughter is about to graduate from college with a 3.8 GPA while working 2 jobs. Their son is studying engineering at community college because that is what the family can afford, and he has never once said it is not enough. These people left everything they knew, everything they had, their careers, their homes, their country, and they came here and started over from nothing. From nothing." Steve took a step toward the audience, and his voice dropped to a level that was somehow more devastating than shouting. "And you laughed at them. You looked at people who have sacrificed more than you will probably ever understand, and you laughed because their clothes are not expensive enough for you. Because they do not look the way you think people on television are supposed to look." Craig was staring at the floor. The woman next to him had physically moved away from him. The people in the surrounding seats were looking at him with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Let me tell you something about clothes," Steve continued, turning to address the full audience now. "Clothes do not tell you who a person is. Clothes tell you what a person can afford, and what a person can afford is not who they are. I grew up with nothing. I lived in my car. I wore the same suit to every audition for years because I only had one suit. And when I finally made it, the first thing I learned was that the people who had helped me when I had nothing were worth more than every person who showed up after I had something. Every single time." The audience erupted. The applause was fierce and immediate, the kind that comes from a room full of people who have been waiting for someone to say what they have always felt. People were on their feet. People were crying. People were pointing at the Acaffer family and applauding directly at them, as if trying to fill the space that Craig's laughter had carved out with something louder and stronger and more deserved. Steve turned back to the Acaffer family. Grace was crying silently, her hand no longer on her blouse but pressed flat against her chest over her heart. Emmanuel was standing with his shoulders back and his chin raised, and the shame that had been on his face moments earlier was gone. In its place was something that looked like relief, the relief of a man who had just been seen for who he actually was rather than what he appeared to be. Steve walked to Emmanuel and stood directly in front of him. "Mr. Acaffer, I want you to look at me." Emmanuel met his eyes. You do not ever have to apologize for what you are wearing, not to that man. Not to anyone in this audience, not to anyone in this country. You left everything behind to give your children a chance, and that makes you one of the richest men I have ever met. Not in money, in character. And character, my brother, is the only currency that never loses its value. Emmanuel pressed his lips together hard, fighting to maintain the composure he had held for 11 years. Then, for the first time his children had ever seen in public, Emmanuel Ockhafer's eyes filled with tears. He did not wipe them away. He let them fall, and each one carried the weight of 11 years of silence, 11 years of swallowing his pride and polishing his shoes and walking into a building to clean floors that he was overqualified to manage. Adiz stepped forward. "Mr. Harvey, I want to say something." Steve turned to her. "My father was the most respected man in our community in Lagos. People came to him for advice. Companies trusted him with millions of naira. When we came here, he went from a corner office to a broom closet, and he never said a word about it. Not to us. Not to anyone. He did it so I could go to college. He did it so my brother could study engineering. He did it so our family could have a future in this country." Her voice was shaking, but her words were iron. "That man in the audience laughed at my father's shirt. My father's shirt was bought at a thrift store so that the money he saved could go toward my tuition. Every piece of clothing my father wears is a sacrifice he made for us. So when that man laughed, he was not laughing at a shirt. He was laughing at a father's love, and I will not let anyone laugh at that." The audience gave Adiz a standing ovation that shook the studio. Steve Harvey stood beside her, nodding, his own eyes wet, and when the applause finally subsided, he said, "Young lady, your father's sacrifice is going to produce a generation of Okafors who change this world. And it started with a man who polished his shoes every morning and walked into a job that was beneath his ability because his family's future was above his pride. That is what a hero looks like. Not a cape, not a costume, a pair of polished shoes and a thrift store shirt." Steve turned to the production booth. "We are going to continue this game, and we are going to treat this family with the respect they deserve. Every family that walks onto this stage deserves respect, regardless of what they are wearing, what they look like, or where they come from. That is not a suggestion. That is the rule of this house. And anyone who has a problem with it knows where the door is." Nobody left. The game resumed, and the Ockhafer family played with a fire that had not been there before. The mockery that should have broken them had done the opposite. It had lit something inside every single one of them. Grace gave 2 consecutive #1 answers. Emmanuel delivered a response with such authority that Steve stepped back from the podium and said, "The accountant is in the building." Adiz and Chitty were flawless. Obera closed out the round with an answer that made the entire studio erupt. The Okafors won. They made it to fast money, and Emmanuel and Grace combined for 216 points, the highest score of the entire taping week. When the $20,000 prize was revealed, the family embraced in a circle so tight that you could not tell where one person ended and another began. Emmanuel held Grace and whispered something in Igbo that the microphones did not catch, but that made Grace smile through her tears. The audience gave them yet another standing ovation, and this time it lasted so long that Steve had to gently wave for quiet so he could finish the show. But Steve was not finished. Before the cameras stopped rolling, he made an announcement. "The Ockhafer family came to this country from Nigeria 11 years ago. Emmanuel was a senior accountant. His credentials were not recognized. He has been working as a janitor to put his children through school. I think we can do something about that." Steve announced that his foundation would be connecting Emmanuel with a credential recognition program that helped internationally educated professionals get their qualifications certified in the United States. He also announced that the show would be setting up education funds for both Adiz and Chitty, ensuring that tuition would not be a burden for either of them going forward. Emmanuel stood on that stage, and for the second time that day, cried. But these were different tears. These were the tears of a man who had spent 11 years accepting that his past life was gone, and who was suddenly being told that maybe, just maybe, pieces of it could be recovered. Grace held his hand, and Adiz held his other hand, and Chitty stood behind him with his hand on his father's shoulder, and the family that had walked onto that stage in thrift store clothes walked off it carrying something that no amount of money could buy. The knowledge that they had been seen. Truly, completely, fully seen. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, it detonated across the internet. The clip of Steve Harvey confronting Craig was viewed over 80 million times in the first week. It became the most shared Family Feud moment of the year and one of the most discussed television clips of the decade. But it was not the confrontation that people kept coming back to. It was what followed. Adiz's speech about her father's shirt, Emmanuel's tears, Steve's line about polished shoes and a thrift store shirt. Those were the moments that embedded themselves in people's hearts and refused to leave. The response from immigrant communities around the world was staggering. Families from Nigeria, Ghana, India, the Philippines, Mexico, and dozens of other countries shared the clip and posted their own stories of parents who had given up prestigious careers to start over in new countries, working jobs that were far beneath their qualifications, so their children could have opportunities they had sacrificed everything to provide. The hashtag that emerged, "My father's shirt," was used over 5 million times in the first month. Under that hashtag, sons and daughters posted photos of their immigrant parents in work uniforms and cleaning scrubs and security guard outfits, accompanied by descriptions of the careers they had left behind and the reasons they had made that sacrifice. It became one of the most powerful tributes to immigrant sacrifice in the history of social media. Emmanuel's story caught the attention of several organizations dedicated to helping internationally educated professionals navigate the American credentialing system. Within 3 months, he was enrolled in a bridge program that would allow his Nigerian accounting qualifications to be recognized in the United States. He continued working as a janitor during the process, waking up early to study for certification exams before his shift, the same way his daughter studied for college exams after her shifts. Adiz later said that watching her father study at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning, his textbooks spread out next to his janitor's uniform, was the proudest she had ever been of anyone. 9 months after the episode aired, Emmanuel Okafor passed his CPA examination. 52 years old, he had not practiced accounting professionally in over a decade, and he passed on his first attempt. When Grace called Steve Harvey's team to share the news, Steve personally called Emmanuel to congratulate him. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. Steve later told his radio audience that he cried for most of it. "This man cleaned floors for 11 years so his kids could go to school," Steve said, and then he went back and reclaimed the career he sacrificed. At 52 years old, if that does not make you believe that human beings are capable of extraordinary things, nothing will. Emmanuel was hired as a staff accountant at a mid-size firm in Cleveland within 2 months of passing his exam. On his first day, he wore a new suit that the family had pooled their money to buy, but he wore the same shoes, the same polished, cracking, beautiful shoes that he had been wearing for years. When a colleague commented on them, Emmanuel smiled and said, "These shoes have walked me through the hardest years of my life. They have earned the right to walk me through the best ones too." Adiz graduated from Cleveland State summa cum laude and was accepted into a master's program in accounting. She told every interviewer the same thing: "I am not doing this for me. I am doing this because my father's career was taken from him, and I am going to build one so strong that nobody can ever take it from our family again." Chitty transferred from community college to Case Western Reserve University on a partial scholarship to study mechanical engineering. Obira, inspired by his brother's reinvention, enrolled in a certification program for financial planning and began the process of rebuilding his own professional career. Craig, the man who had laughed, never spoke publicly about the incident. But several months after the episode aired, a woman who identified herself as his sister posted a message on social media. She said that watching the episode had been a turning point for their family. She said Craig had grown up in a household where appearance and status were valued above character, and that the Family Feud moment had forced him to confront biases he had never examined. She said he had reached out to the Okafor family through the show's producers to apologize. Whether the Okafors accepted the apology was never made public, and the family never commented on it. They did not need to. Their response had already been given on that stage in that moment through the dignity with which they carried themselves when someone tried to strip it away. Steve Harvey talked about the Okafor family for years. He referenced Emmanuel's shoes in commencement speeches, corporate keynotes, and interviews. He called it the most important lesson he had ever delivered on television, not because of what he said to Craig, but because of what the Okafor family had taught him. "I shut that man down," Steve would say. "But Emmanuel Okafor, he shut down every excuse I have ever made about why I cannot do something." That man cleaned floors for 11 years and never once used it as a reason to stop believing in himself. If Emmanuel Okafor can polish his shoes and walk into a building to mop floors with a finance degree in his pocket and a dream still alive in his chest, then none of us have the right to quit. None of us. 1 year after the episode, the Okafor family returned to Family Feud for a follow-up segment. They walked onto the stage in new matching shirts, dark green with gold lettering that read "Okafor Strong." Emmanuel was wearing a tailored blazer over his shirt, and on his feet, polished to their usual mirror shine, were the same shoes. Steve saw them and laughed, the real joyful laugh of a man reuniting with people who had changed him. He kneeled down, looked at the shoes, looked up at Emmanuel, and said, "Still the cleanest shoes in the building." Emmanuel smiled. "Always, Mr. Harvey." "My father taught me well." Grace spoke last during the follow-up segment. She stood at the podium where she had once reached self-consciously for her worn blouse, and she addressed the cameras with the full, unguarded voice of a woman who no longer had anything to prove to anyone. "1 year ago, a man in this audience laughed at my family because of our clothes. Today, I want to thank him." The audience murmured in surprise. Grace continued. "He gave Steve Harvey the opportunity to say something that millions of people needed to hear. He gave my husband the chance to be recognized for who he truly is. And he gave my children proof that dignity cannot be taken from you by someone who never had it themselves." She paused. "We came to this country with 2 suitcases and a dream. We are leaving this stage with something that no one can fit in a suitcase and no one can take away. We are leaving with the knowledge that our sacrifice was not invisible, and that is worth more than any amount of money. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another one. Leave a comment below and tell us about someone in your life who sacrificed everything for their family. Share this video with every person you know, because the Ackhafer family story is a reminder that the richest people in the world are not the ones with the most money. They are the ones with the most character. We will see you in the next one.